The night Richard Ashton turned 34. The rain came down sideways over Charleston, soaking the cobblestone streets and turning the harbor into a silver mirror. He had driven past 3 restaurants before stopping at Belmore's, a place with warm amber light spilling through its tall windows and the faint sound of a piano drifting onto the wet sidewalk. He had no reservation. He had no plan. He simply wanted a decent meal, a quiet corner, and permission to forget that this day existed. Richard was not the kind of man most people recognized on the street. He did not appear on magazine covers or attend charity galas with photographers trailing behind him. He owned 3 shipping companies, a real estate portfolio that stretched across 4 states, and a name that moved quietly through financial circles the way cold air moves through a room. He wore a simple gray jacket that evening, his dark hair slightly damp, and he looked more than anything like a man who was tired. The hostess at Belmore's had the practiced smile of someone who categorized people within 3 seconds of looking at them. She looked at Richard and placed him in the category of man who had wandered in from the rain without understanding how things worked here. "Good evening," she said pleasantly. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" "I don't," Richard said. "I was hoping you might have something available. Just a table for 1. I'll—" The hostess glanced at her screen and then at Richard again, with the kind of sympathy that contains no actual sympathy. "I'm so sorry. We're completely booked for the evening. We do have a waiting list, though. The estimated wait would be around 2 hours. Richard looked past her into the dining room. He could see 4 empty tables from where he stood. 2 had reserved placards. 2 did not. "Those 2 tables," he said calmly. "They appear to be available. Those are being held for parties expected within the hour," she said without blinking. At that moment, Pete Garland, the restaurant manager, appeared from the side hallway wearing a blazer 2 sizes too tight and an expression that suggested he had been listening. He was a short man with sharp features and the habit of making himself feel tall by making others feel small. "Is there a problem here?" Pete asked, directing the question to the hostess and not to Richard. "The gentleman doesn't have a reservation," she said. Pete looked at Richard the way people look at a smudge on a window. "I'm afraid we simply can't accommodate walk-ins on a Friday evening, sir. This is a reservation-based establishment." He paused just long enough to let the words settle. "Perhaps somewhere down the street might suit you better." Richard said nothing. He had been spoken to that way before, in boardrooms, in banks. In the early days when he was building something from almost nothing, he had learned that the people who spoke to him that way were never the ones worth correcting. He turned and walked back toward the entrance. He did not make it to the door. "Excuse me?" The voice came from a small table near the window, set slightly apart from the main dining room, the kind of table that staff used during breaks. A young woman sat there with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her and a paperback opened face down beside it. She had light brown hair, pulled back loosely, and she was still wearing her server's apron, which meant she was on a break and not supposed to be talking to guests she was looking at. Richard with an expression that was not pity and not curiosity. It was something closer to recognition, as though she had seen something in the last 2 minutes that she understood completely. "You can sit here if you want," she said. "My break is 20 minutes and I haven't touched my food yet. I'll have them bring you a menu." Richard looked at her. Then he looked at the table. Then he looked back at Pete, who was watching from across the room with an expression that had shifted from dismissal to calculation. "I don't want to take your break," Richard said. "You're not taking it. I'm offering it." She pulled out the chair across from her. "My name is Emma. I've worked here 3 years, and Pete has never once let me eat in the main dining room anyway, so you're not exactly downgrading." There was no performance in the way she said it, no attempt to be charming or noticed. It was simply the kind of honesty that comes from a person who has stopped spending energy on pretending things are other than they are. Richard sat down. Emma flagged down a passing server and asked quietly for a menu and a glass of water for her guest. The server looked between them with visible confusion, then went to get both without asking Pete, which told Richard that Emma was someone people listened to even when they did not have to. "Thank you," Richard said when the water arrived. "It's just a chair," Emma said. opening her book again in a way that made clear she was not expecting conversation. Richard looked at the menu. The steak was listed at $42. The soup of the evening was a roasted butternut bisque. He realized he was actually hungry, the kind of hungry that comes from skipping lunch and running on coffee since early morning. "Any recommendations?" he asked. Emma looked up from the book. She seemed to consider whether he was making conversation for its own sake, or actually asking. "The bisque is good tonight. Carl made it, and he doesn't cut corners with the cream. The halibut is better than the steak, even though the steak costs more. The desserts are all made off-site, and they charge too much for them." "That's the most honest review I've ever received at a restaurant," Richard said. "You asked," she said simply. He ordered the halibut and the bisque. Emma ate her own food, a simple pasta she had clearly brought from elsewhere in the kitchen. And they sat in a comfortable silence that surprised Richard more than any conversation might have. He could not remember the last time he had sat across from someone who asked nothing of him. No pitch. No question that was really a favor in disguise. No performance. After a few minutes, Emma looked up from her plate. "It's your birthday," she said. It was not a question. Richard paused. "What makes you say that? You came in alone in the rain with no reservation on a Friday night, and you had that look when Pete spoke to you. Not embarrassed. Not angry. Just tired in a specific way. Like you expected the day to be better than it was." Richard set down his fork. "That's an unusually precise observation." "I've been watching people eat for 3 years," Emma said. "You learn things." He almost smiled. "It is my birthday, 34. Emma raised her coffee cup slightly. "Happy birthday, Richard." He had not told her his name. But his credit card was on the table where the server had set it down earlier, face up, while asking if he wanted to start a tab. She had seen it and remembered. He found, strangely, that he did not mind. "Thank you, Emma," he said. The piano in the main dining room shifted to something slower and quieter. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady rhythm against the glass. Richard ate his halibut, which was as good as Emma had promised. And for the first time since waking that morning in his empty house, on the edge of the harbor, he felt something that was not quite happiness, but was in the same neighborhood. Something that felt improbably like being in the right place. He did not know yet that Emma Caldwell had spent the last 3 months sleeping on a fold-out couch so her younger sister could have the bedroom. He did not know about the second job she worked on, Sunday mornings, or the debt that had followed her since her mother's illness 2 years ago. And she did not know who he was, not really, not yet. In that small break table by the window, with rain on the glass and a cold piano playing in the other room, they were simply 2 people sharing a space without wanting anything from it, which was... Richard would later think exactly how the best things begin. When Emma's break ended, she stood and gathered her book and her cup. She looked at Richard in that same direct way she had looked at him from across the room an hour ago. "The halibut was good?" she asked. "Everything was," he said. She nodded once as though filing the information away and returned to the dining room. Richard sat for another few minutes, watching the rain on the window. Then he asked for the check. He left a tip that was more than the cost of the meal. Not because he was making a point, but because the evening had given him something he had not expected to find. And he did not know any other way to acknowledge it. He walked out into the rain and stood on the cobblestones for a moment, looking back through the amber glass at the restaurant interior, where he could see Emma moving between tables with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since stopped waiting to be seen. He would come back tomorrow. He did not know why he was certain of that. He simply was. Richard did come back the next day. He arrived at Belmore's at 6:30. This time with the quiet confidence of someone who had made a decision and intended to follow through with it. He wore a navy jacket and no tie, which for him was the closest thing to casual. He asked the hostess for a table in Emma's section without explaining why. And because he had made a proper reservation this time, she smiled and let him without question. "Pete." Garland spotted him from across the room and did the kind of double take that belongs in a cartoon. Richard did not acknowledge him. Emma appeared at the table. 2 minutes later, with a notepad and an expression that shifted from professional courtesy to something slightly warmer when she recognized him. She did not make a production of it. "You came back," she said. "The halibut was as good as you promised," Richard said. "I thought I'd test the rest of the menu." "The sea bass is excellent on Saturdays," she said. "Carl uses a lemon caper sauce that he perfected over about 6 years. He'll tell you the story if you ask him. It takes a while." "I'm not in a hurry," Richard said. Emma looked at him for a moment, with that same measuring quality she had shown the night before. "Most people who come in here are always in a hurry," she said. "They eat like they have somewhere more important to be." "I've spent years eating like that," Richard said. "It turns out nowhere is as important as people convince themselves it." Ishi almost smiled. Almost. Then she took his order and moved away with the steady rhythm of someone who has learned to carry a great deal without showing the weight of it. Richard returned the following Saturday, and the one after that. Each time he sat in Emma's section, each time they exchanged a few minutes of conversation that was entirely unlike the conversations he had everywhere else in his life. Emma did not ask about his work. She did not mention money or connections or the kind of questions people wove into small talk when they had already researched a person before meeting them. She talked about the book she was reading, a story about a lighthouse keeper in Nova Scotia. She talked about the way the harbor looked before sunrise when the fishing boats went out. She talked about her sister Clara and the way Clara laughed at her own jokes before finishing them, which was either deeply annoying or completely wonderful, depending on the day Richard listened. In a way, he rarely listened to anyone. It was on the 4th Saturday that he arrived at the restaurant and found Emma's section empty and a different server apologizing and explaining that Emma had called in for the evening. Richard left without ordering. He stood on the cobblestones outside and thought for a moment about what he was actually doing, what this collection of Saturday evenings meant, and whether a reasonable man would simply go home. He took out his phone and sent a message to the number he had quietly memorized from the staff directory he had no business accessing. He had not allowed himself to use it until now. I hope everything is all right, he typed. "This is Richard from Table 4. I realize that is a strange way to identify myself." The response came 11 minutes later. "It's fine. Clara had a situation. I'm sorry you made a trip for nothing." "The trip wasn't for nothing," he wrote back. "Is Clara okay?" There was a longer pause this time. "Then she will be." Richard looked at the harbor and made another decision. He found Emma's apartment building through the restaurant's emergency contact records, which he accessed through a connection he felt genuinely uncomfortable using. He brought food from a place 3 blocks away. The good kind. Containers of proper warm food, and not the sad assortment of someone trying to make a gesture. He stood outside the building for a moment, wondering if this was the kind of thing a reasonable person did. And then he pressed the buzzer because Emma Caldwell had offered him a chair when she had no reason to. And he intended to return that specific quality of kindness. Emma opened the door of her apartment on the 4th floor with an expression that moved through surprise, confusion, and then something like helpless amusement in about 3 seconds. "How do you know where I live?" she asked. "I used a connection I shouldn't have," Richard said honestly. "I can explain and apologize simultaneously if that helps." Emma looked at the containers of food in his hands. Then she opened the door wider and stepped aside. The apartment was small in the way that speaks not of taste but of budget. A fold-out couch was open in the living room with a pillow and blanket folded neatly at one end. The bedroom door was closed. The kitchen was clean and organized with the particular order of someone who controls what they can because everything else feels uncontrollable. On the counter, 3 envelopes were stacked with the careful avoidance of someone who knows what is inside them and is not ready. Clara was 19 and had her sister's same directness in a slightly louder key. She appeared from the bedroom with her arm wrapped and her chin set at the angle of someone who does not want to discuss it. She looked at Richard, then at the food, then at Emma. "Is this the man from the restaurant?" Clara asked. "Yes," Emma said. "Good," Clara said, and sat at the kitchen table as though his presence had been arranged in advance. Emma set out the food without ceremony. The 3 of them ate together, and Clara talked with the kind of energy that fills silence, because silence in that apartment had recently held too much. She talked about her design course, about a professor who could not grasp perspective, about a friend who had lent her a jacket she intended to keep forever. Richard asked questions and meant them, and Clara answered with the satisfaction of someone being genuinely heard. Emma watched the two of them talk and said very little. Later, when Clara had gone back to the bedroom and the containers were cleared, Emma and Richard sat at the small kitchen table with cups of tea she had made without asking whether he wanted any. She set one in front of him and sat down and looked at the envelopes on the counter with the expression of someone who has been postponing a conversation with themselves.
Medical debt,
she said quietly, not looking at Richard. From when my mother was sick? I've been managing it, but slowly. Richard said nothing. He understood that she was not asking for anything. She was simply putting a thing into the room because keeping it outside the room had begun to cost more than saying it. The couch, he said after a moment. You sleep on it, so Clara has the bedroom. She's in school, Emma said simply. She needs the sleep more than I do. Richard looked at his tea. Emma, don't, she said, with a gentleness that took the edge off the word. I know what you're about to offer, and I need you to understand something first. I have spent 3 years building something that is mine. It is small, and it is hard, and it is completely mine. The moment I accept the kind of help you're thinking about offering, I will spend every day wondering whether I'm capable of my own life or whether someone simply bought me a better version of it. That's not what I think of you, Richard said. I know that, Emma said. But it's what I'll think of myself. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of two people recognizing something true about each other at the same time. Then let me ask you something different, Richard said. Not about money. Not about any of that. Can I take you somewhere on your next day off? Not a restaurant. Somewhere outside where nobody needs a reservation and Pete Garland does not exist. Looked at him across the small kitchen table with the amber light from the single overhead bulb making the room feel warmer than its size suggested. Outside, Charleston was doing what Charleston does at night. The harbor moving quietly, the old streets holding their history without apology. Tuesday, she said. I'm off Tuesday. Tuesday, Richard agreed. He left shortly after, walking down the 4 flights of stairs and out onto the cobblestones, and he stood for a moment in the night air thinking about a woman who slept on a fold-out couch so her sister could rest, who told him the truth about halibut, who had offered him a chair with no expectation attached to the offering. He had built companies from smaller foundations than this. On Tuesday morning, Richard arrived at Emma's building at 9 with 2 coffees and no particular plan, which was genuinely unprecedented in his adult life. Emma came down wearing a light jacket and practical shoes, and she looked at him with that almost smile and said, "Wow, you look nervous." "I don't have an agenda," he said. "It's disorienting." "Good," she said, and took one of the coffees. They walked along the Battery and then through the historic district, past the old houses with their piazzas and their paint-peeled dignity. Emma talked about the architecture with the familiarity of someone who had looked at it long enough to understand it. She pointed out a building on Meeting Street where she had wanted to rent a small studio once, before the numbers made it impossible. She said it plainly, without self-pity. The way she said most things, Richard listened and did not offer solutions. At noon they sat on a bench near the water with sandwiches from a place Emma chose. A small counter-service spot with crooked letters on the window and bread that was clearly made that morning. The sandwiches cost $9 each, and they were the best thing Richard had eaten in recent memory, which he said out loud. "Expensive things are not always the best things," Emma said. "I'm learning that," Richard said. She looked at him sideways. "What do you actually want, Richard?" "From this?" "From me. Because you are clearly a man who gets what he wants. When he decides he wants it, and I would rather know the answer, now than find it out later when it is inconvenient." Richard set down his sandwich and looked at the harbor. A pelican landed on the railing nearby and regarded them both with the serene indifference of a creature that has solved most of life's problems. "I want to know you," Richard said. "The version of you that exists when nobody is trying to get anything from the situation. I have very few people in my life who are present without an angle, and you are somehow the least angled person I have ever met. Emma considered this for a long moment. The pelican left. I am also the person who earns $12 an hour plus tips and sleeps on a fold-out couch, she said. I know that, Richard said. It has not once changed my interest in what I just described. Emma looked at the water. I'm not going to pretend that your world and mine are not very different, she said quietly. I'm not going to perform being unbothered by that because I think the honesty between us is the best thing we have, and I don't want to damage it. Then don't perform anything, Richard said. Just keep doing what you were doing when you offered a stranger your break table because it was the right thing to do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him with an expression that was open and careful, and something else entirely. The kind of look that people give when they are deciding whether to trust something that feels too good to be safe. Okay, she said finally. But if this goes wrong, I'm blaming the halibut. Richard laughed. A full and real laugh that startled a nearby pigeon into flight. That's fair,
he said.
And sitting there on a bench in Charleston with $9 sandwiches. And the harbor going silver in the midday light. Two people from entirely different worlds decided quietly and without ceremony to find out what they might build together in the space between them. It was, by every measure, a beginning. 3 months passed the way good months do. Quickly, and with the feeling that time is finally being spent rather than simply endured. Richard and Emma found a rhythm that belonged entirely to them. Tuesday mornings on the Battery with sandwiches from the crooked-lettered counter shop. Sunday evenings, when Emma finished her second job at the bakery on King Street, and Richard would be waiting outside with coffee and no particular plan. Phone calls that started as brief check-ins and stretched into an hour without either of them noticing. Clara noticed everything, of course. She had the particular talent of the younger sibling who has nothing to lose by saying what everyone else is thinking. You smile differently now, she told Emma one morning. Sitting cross-legged on the kitchen counter while Emma made breakfast. I smile the same way I always have, Emma said. You smiled before like someone who had decided to be fine, Clara said. Now you smile like someone who actually is. Emma turned back to the stove and said nothing, which Clara correctly interpreted as agreement. Richard's world had also shifted in ways he was still measuring. His assistant, Beverly, a sharp woman of 50 who had worked with him for 9 years and knew him better than most people alive, noticed that he had stopped scheduling breakfast meetings on Tuesday mornings and had begun leaving the office before 8 in the evening, which she described to a colleague as nothing short of miraculous. He told his mother about Emma on a Sunday afternoon call that he had been postponing for 2 weeks. Linda Ashton received information. The way certain buildings receive wind, by redirecting it rather than absorbing it. She was 71, elegant, and had spent 40 years building a version of the Ashton name that she considered a kind of architecture. Something that required the right materials. A waitress, Linda said. Not cruelly, simply placing the word in the air between them. A person, Richard said, who happens to work as a server while managing a significant number of other things simultaneously. Richard, mother. The pause on the line had the quality of a negotiation in which both sides already know the outcome but observe the formalities. Regardless, I'd like to meet her, Linda said finally. That will happen when Emma decides. She's ready for that, Richard said. Not before. Another pause. You sound different, Linda said. I feel different, Richard said. He did not elaborate, and Linda, to her credit, did not press. She had not built what she built by misreading the moments when pushing would cost more than waiting. Emma found out about Linda's request on a Wednesday evening when she and Richard were walking along the waterfront after dinner. The air smelled of salt and something faintly floral from the gardens along the Battery. Emma was quiet for longer than usual after he told her. She wants to assess whether I'm appropriate, Emma said. Not accusatorially, just accurately, probably, Richard said. She'll find that you're more than appropriate. She'll also probably not say that directly for several months. I'm not afraid of being assessed, Emma said. I've been assessed my whole life by people who decided the answer before asking the question. She paused. I just want you to know that I will not perform anything for her benefit. I will be exactly who I am." "That's all I want," Richard said. "Good," Emma said, "because it's also all I have." He reached over and took her hand as they walked, and she let him, and neither of them made any remark about it, which was exactly the right response. The meeting with Linda happened on a Saturday morning at the Ashton house on South Battery, a white columned building that looked out over the water with the composed authority of something that has been standing long enough to stop worrying about its own importance. Emma wore a green dress she had borrowed from Clara, who had selected it with the focused intensity of a person who understands that certain moments require the right armor. Linda Ashton was standing in the front parlor when they arrived. She was tall and silver-haired and had the kind of posture that makes rooms feel smaller. She looked at Emma with a directness that was almost refreshing in its lack of social softening. "Emma Caldwell," Linda said. "Mrs. Ashton?" Emma said, and met the directness evenly. They sat in the parlor with coffee that had been prepared by someone Richard referred to as Thomas, without further introduction. Linda asked questions with the methodical patience of someone conducting an interview she has conducted many times before. She asked about Emma's family, her work, her plans, her sister. She asked each question in a way that could have felt like interrogation, but landed closer to genuine curiosity, which surprised Emma slightly. Emma answered everything honestly. She described her mother's illness and the debt that followed. She described sleeping on the fold-out couch. She described Clara's design program and the pride she felt watching her sister build something real. She did not apologize for any of it, and she did not embellish any of it. Linda listened with her hands folded in her lap and an expression that gave nothing away. At one point, Linda said, "My son has spent a great deal of his life surrounded by people who wanted access to what he represents. He became careful to the point of isolation." "I know," Emma said. "He walked into the restaurant where I work, and the manager turned him away, and I offered him a chair at my break. It's a table because it was the right thing to do, and I had an empty chair. That's the beginning of the story." "There's no calculation in it," Linda said, studying her. "I don't believe there is." The rest of the morning passed with something approaching ease. Linda showed Emma the garden, which she tended herself and spoke about with an unguarded affection that was entirely different from her parlor manner. She knew every plant by name and growing condition, and the particular season each one required. Emma listened with genuine interest and asked real questions. And something in Linda seemed to settle. On the drive back, Richard glanced at Emma. "Well, she loves you very much," Emma said. "She's afraid of what loving you costs if she gets it wrong." Richard was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's the accurate one," Emma said. "She'll come around. She just needs to see that I'm not going anywhere." 4 weeks later, the thing that Richard had not anticipated arrived in the form of Derek Harmon. Derek had been Emma's boyfriend for 2 years before Clara's situation, before the debt, before the accumulation of pressures that had worn the relationship to nothing. He was a man who believed that returning made a person generous rather than simply late. And he arrived back in Emma's life with an ease that suggested he had never genuinely accepted his absence from it. Emma told Richard about Derek the evening after Derek appeared at Belmore's and sat in her section with the relaxed entitlement of someone who considers an ex-girlfriend a possession with a return policy. "He wants to try again," Emma said. She and Richard were sitting in the small kitchen of her apartment, which had become one of Richard's favorite places without him entirely meaning for that to happen. "What do you want?" Richard asked. Emma looked at him with an expression that was patient and slightly exasperated simultaneously. "I'm sitting in my kitchen telling you about it," she said. "If I wanted Derek, I would be sitting in Derek's kitchen not telling anyone anything." "That's a reasonable point," Richard said. "The issue," Emma continued, "is that Derek told me something before he left. He said that Richard Ashton of Ashton Capital reaches men like him at a certain point where the new thing becomes ordinary and he moves on to the next new thing. He said I should think carefully about which version of my life I actually belong in." Richard was quiet. The refrigerator made a small sound. Outside, A car passed on the street below. "What did you think about that?" he asked. "I thought that Derek has spent his entire life allowing fear to make his decisions for him and then presenting those decisions as wisdom," Emma said. "And I thought that what he said was not really about me at all." "It wasn't," Richard said. "I know." Emma set her tea down. "But I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." "Always," Richard said. "Is this something you intend to continue?" Emma said, "Not because of novelty. Not because I am refreshing or uncalculating or any of the things that make me interesting to you right now, but because you have genuinely looked at my life, the debt and the couch and the $9 sandwiches and Clara and Pete Garland and all of it, and you are choosing it." Richard did not answer immediately. He looked at Emma across the kitchen table with the overhead light between them, and he thought about the night he had stood in the rain, outside a restaurant wanting a quiet meal in a corner and permission to forget that his birthday existed. He thought about a chair being offered without expectation. He thought about halibut and cold coffee and a drawing that Clara had made of the three of them on a napkin 2 weeks ago and stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. "I'm choosing it," he said. "Every part of it, without reservation." Emma held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, with the particular quality of a person who has asked an important question and received an answer they intend to hold someone to. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Derek did not come back to Belmore's. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning in October, Richard arrived at Emma's building at 9 as he always did. Only this time he was carrying coffee and also a set of keys on a simple silver ring. Emma opened the door and looked at the keys and then at him. "I bought the studio on Meeting Street," he said. "The one you pointed out the first time we walked together. It's yours, Emma. The deed is in your name. Not a gift from me to you. A thing that belongs to you. I am not in it. It does not come with conditions or expectations or anything that resembles what Derek described. It is simply yours because you should have a space that is completely yours, and because I can do that, and because doing it changes nothing between us except that you will sleep in a proper bed." Emma stared at the keys. "Clara keeps the apartment," Richard continued. "She needs stability for her program. You get the studio. I get nothing except the knowledge that you are sleeping horizontally." Emma's eyes were bright. She was not a person who cried easily, which made the brightness mean something. "You are a very difficult man to argue with," she said. "Beverly says the same thing," Richard said. "Every single day." Emma took the keys. She held them for a moment and looked at them, and then she looked at Richard with that expression. The open and careful one that he had first seen on a park bench with $9 sandwiches. The one that meant she was deciding whether to trust something that felt too good to be safe. She had decided. "Come in," she said. "Clara made pancakes, and she wants to tell you about the prospective professor again." "Was hoping for that," Richard said honestly. He stepped inside, and the door closed. Behind him, and Clara's voice came from the kitchen already mid-sentence about something involving shadow, angles, and institutional failure. Emma's apartment was warm and small and full of the specific life of two people who had built something real from almost nothing. And Richard stood in it and felt more completely than he had felt anything in a very long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, not because of what he owned or what he had built or what his name meant in certain rooms, but because a woman with a paperback and a cold cup of coffee had looked across a restaurant at a man standing in the rain and decided, for no reason except that it was right, to offer him a chair, and he had taken it, and neither of them had ever quite left that table.